Unit 11, outside.
Okay, on my way.
My name is Andrew Small, and I'm a police officer in what has to be the single, bizarrest, most otherworldly place on the face of the earth. A small town in the middle of nowhere called Junction Falls. Here are a few of our strangest cases. July 15th, 2006 was a fairly quiet night right up until around 9:30 p.m. Then all hell broke loose. We got calls from no fewer than 24 livid homeowners who all claimed they couldn't sleep because a film had begun to play at the old Westbrook DriveIn. Now that immediately gave us a pause, because the Westbrook had been closed down ever since the multiplex had forced it out of business in 1979, so any screening there was obviously unauthorized. When we arrived, an old so bad it's good sci-fi horror movie from 1956 called It Came From Mars was indeed playing at full brightness and volume, but we never did find anyone at the lot who could have been responsible. In fact, the only thing there was a single red 1950 Crossley station wagon, which was also empty, sitting in space 21B. We figured we'd find out who put that there and started the film later on. For now, we needed to shut down the movie before all the locals started a riot in their bathrobes and slippers. Now this is where things get wild. We looked everywhere. In the operations booth, in the old concession stands, in that old car, and in any nearby trees tall enough to have any line of sight to the screen. But no sound or projection equipment could be found anywhere within a mile radius of the lot. As far as we could tell, the film was playing completely on its own. Luckily, the lot plunged back into its natural dark, silent state when the second movie finished. The Crossley wagon vanished too, but that really only left us frustrated and confused. After that, at least, nothing else interesting happened at Westbrook for a good while. The so-called mystery screening case started to get buried under more pressing work, and as the months dragged on, we began to forget about it entirely. But then, at exactly 9:30 p.m. on July 15th, 2007, the screening began anew, and the same events more or less repeated themselves. Angry locals, an empty lot, the Crossley station wagon in space 21B, and an exhaustive but untimely, fruitless search for the responsible individuals and offending equipment. We were honestly pulling our hair out, and it didn't stop there either. The next July 15th, same thing. And it happened again the next year, and the one after that, and the one after that. And it's happened every year since July 15th at 9:30. It Came From Mars, Red Crossley, clockwork. As of this posting, we still have no idea how the film is being shown in the absence of a projection or even sound equipment, but we have discovered some other things about the film since the case began. It Came From Mars was financed entirely by a man named Bill Booth, who also wrote, directed, and starred in the film as its protagonist, Jack Brunley, and he believed the film would launch his Hollywood career. However, production was plagued with setbacks almost from the beginning. Costs ballooned. 2 actors and the chief editor quit halfway through, thus forcing an inexperienced Booth to edit the film himself, something he clearly had no business in doing if the final result is any indication. Booth eventually went bankrupt when he paid the rest of his family savings to the Westbrook DriveIn Theater to hold the movie's premiere on July 15th, 1956. Sadly though, It Came From Mars received overwhelmingly negative reviews from a few critics who attended their own screening, and Booth attended the official premiere alone, as the cast and crew were too embarrassed to be associated with it. Then, his wife left him the following month due to their declining financial situation. Humiliated, penniless, and alone, Bill Booth drove his red 1950 Crossley station wagon to the Westbrook, parked once again in space 21B, and shot himself in the mouth. A forgotten off-Hollywood tragedy. Now, obviously none of this explains the physics of how a film could play on its own, or how an old car can appear and vanish the way the Crossley does every July 15th. So officially, the case remains unsolved. When the above details were first reported by the Junction Falls Dispatch in April of this year, the story of what many assumed to be that of an old filmmaker's ghost caused a sensation, and on July 15th, 349 people came and joined a red 1950s Crossley station wagon in watching this stupid, tacky, low-budget, wonderful film. Status: unsolved. About 10 or 12 miles southeast of Junction Falls, near the hiking trails, you will find an old ghost town called Stamford Springs. Now, I'm no expert on it. I'm sure the local rangers and tour guides could fill you in if you're interested. But from what I understand, it used to be a tiny little late 19th century community in its heyday that featured a small general store, a clinic, a church, and 12 or 13 houses. Inside the buildings, you'll still see all the original furniture too, and some clothes in closets, toys in the children's rooms, small animal bones in the barns and coops, and various other indications that the town was both lived in and abandoned in a hurry. The verdict is still out there on what caused that. It's eerie and creepy for obvious reasons. It's a popular spot for Halloween hikes and other I dare you type excursions. But here's why I'm writing this. In 2009, a hiker reported hearing cries and whimpers coming from the backyard of one of the houses there. He called it in, and the rangers found and opened a previously undiscovered cellar behind the house, in which a little girl had been staying for an undetermined amount of time. She was dressed in an old gown and scared to death. After confirming she was okay, the rangers asked her all the basics: her name, how she got in there, where and who her parents were, etc. The girl said her name was Abigail, that her parents owned the house above, and that they had put her there and gone back inside to get the rest of the children. Under further questioning, Abigail insists it's 1884 and that her parents have only been gone for a few minutes, not decades. Keep in mind, this girl is maybe 9 or 10 and she's just bawling her eyes out, confused, and so terrified she's shaking. So either she's a future Oscar nominee, putting on the performance of a lifetime for no reason whatsoever, or she really is convinced that she was a resident of this 19th century Stamford Springs. So they take her down to the Junction Falls Medical Center just to get her tested, and she's keeping up with the act too, just in awe of all the people and technology. The scan showed no brain damage, no malnutrition, no other disorders of any kind. She was a perfectly healthy little 9-year-old kid, and she continues to insist that her parents were Thomas and Elizabeth Jones, 19th century shopkeepers. You can probably tell where this is going. The authorities searched extensively for any record of a missing girl matching Abigail's description, and they found nothing. No birth certificate, no medical records, no social security number, and no relatives. And of course, other folk who caught wind of the situation through the dispatch report did some research on their own. And you guessed it, there was indeed a Thomas Jones and an Elizabeth Jones, shopkeepers, who had lived in Stamford Springs in 1884, who also had 3 children, including a daughter named Abigail. Eventually they put Abigail with a child placement agency, and I have no idea what came of her after that, but it's definitely one of the weirdest Junction Falls stories I've ever heard. Well before I joined the JFPD in 2005, a large abandoned 2-story house in the Shelby neighborhood had carved itself quite the reputation. You see, at random times during the night, you can hear the shrill and desperate screams and cries for help, seemingly coming from a woman trapped inside. The department dispatched a unit to investigate. Bizarrely though, the officers were unable to locate the trapped woman because the screams themselves always seemed to be coming from a part of the house that nobody was in or even near. When the screaming came from the master bedroom upstairs, the officers charged up to the 2nd story and entered that room, only to find it empty and that the screaming could now be heard coming from the kitchen. So they went to the kitchen, only to discover the sounds were now coming from the cellar. And when they went to the cellar, they realized they could hear it once again coming from the vicinity of the master bedroom. No matter where they were, the screams and cries were always coming from someplace else. Eventually they called for backup, but even with each room covered by an officer, the team couldn't seem to find the source, or even reach a consensus as to where they were coming from. They never did find that woman either, and each of the 6 men and 3 women who were there suffered at least moderate psychological damage as a result of the experience. As for the hows and whys, the leading official theory, at least in regards to the bouncing sound phenomenon, is that there is some trick of architecture that is wreaking havoc on the acoustics inside the structure. I'm not really sure if anyone buys that, but that's the best we've come up with. No one, and I mean no one, can explain the source of the screams to begin with. No woman has ever been found inside and would never have survived as long as the screams have now lasted anyway. Priests have given it the all clear as far as potential demonic activity, and the man who built the house assures us he is as horrified as we are, and most certainly did not build the place that would mess with the acoustics, let alone with hidden compartments that might have housed a captive woman. The official position of the JFPD? Do not go in or near that place. It still makes those sounds, and we are no closer to figuring it out than we were years ago. Status: unsolved. Sometimes we'll have 2 cases that end up being connected down the road by a single cause and solution. This particular time, the 2 cases were 1. A string of disappearances affecting the local homeless population, and 2. Reports of, and I'm not kidding here, a clown that was allegedly attempting to lure people into the woods. For obvious reasons, we took the former case more seriously. But then, a few weeks into the investigation, a local business owner came by the precinct and delivered to us the previous night's security camera footage that showed a drugged-up homeless man being led off towards the woods by, you guessed it, a post-vaudeville jester with a ruffled collar and a skip in his step. Eventually, we traced that particular vanishing to a small shack in the woods beyond the outskirts of town. We kicked in the door to find a scene of spectacular and breathtaking brutality. All 6 of the homeless men who had been reported missing, including the one from the footage, were not only dead, but mutilated, burnt, twisted, hairless, and disfigured. They had all been experimented on too. One man had all his limbs amputated, and one of each could be found sewn to the backs and sides of 4 other men who had, like him, died of infections. The last man was intact and then some. He had been injected with various substances, ranging from silicone to cement, in order to produce warts and bumps and other unsightly abnormalities of the flesh. We eventually found the clown too, who ended up being an unstable lunatic named Terry Bird. He claimed he was working on behalf of someone known as the Ringmaster. When pressed for further information, Terry claimed he did not know the Ringmaster's identity, but was familiar with his plans. Oddly enough, the Ringmaster wanted only to create and host a classic tour and carnival, and it was going to be called Mr. Mystery's Traveling Circus and Extravaganza. And of course, no good carnival would be complete without a genuine freak show. Terry alleged the Ringmaster had enlisted his help in finding some willing or unwilling volunteers, as he put it. Terry got a life sentence without parole, and we kept up our search for this Ringmaster, but we never did find him. About a year after our own homeless incident, the nearby towns of Doolittle and Crosby Springs reported that their homeless men had been abducted too. We did what we could to help, even going so far as to offer Terry a plea deal for information on the Ringmaster, but he simply laughed and said that he quite liked his cell. It's cozy. As of this posting, any information on the Ringmaster will yield a $10,000 reward. Status: partially solved. Perpetrator at large.